In this video, we're going to go over primary succession and secondary succession. So if you open up your ecology packet to page 10, and then open up your textbook to page 106, you're going to see a diagram that looks like this. A paragraph looks like this I'm going to have you read. And so page 106 in your book and page 10 in your packet. All right, so we're going to start off with primary succession. I know that number 1 says draw the sequential steps of succession. So I've drawn for you. We're going to label it so you have this in your you have this in your packet. Off to the side, I do want to define what succession is. So you can just grab your pen. We're going to, on the side, define succession. And succession is the series of one plant ecosystem replacing another. And where that may not make as much sense to you right now, as we go through this diagram here, we're going to talk about a couple things, and then that definition will make more sense. We're going to write other couple things underneath it. There's two types, primary and secondary. One's going to take longer than the other. Primary is going to be this long one that we're going to talk about. What makes them different is what they start with. Okay, primary succession, as you see over here, doesn't have any plants. It actually starts with bare rock. Okay, plants need soil, nutrients, water, sunlight to grow. That rock provides nothing for a plant. And so it has to go through the process of erosion in order to even make soil. Okay, so once a little bit of soil is made, you're going to start to have a plant species that can kind of move in. And that first plant species is going to be a lichen or a moss. And this picture doesn't really have a lichen or a moss, it just shows the bare rock, but the picture in your book does. Okay, the picture in your book here, if you I just circle around it, that little green stuff right there is a lichen and a moss, and you've seen them growing on rocks, you've seen them growing on sidewalks. Sometimes they can be kind of a funky color like a lime green. And we'll talk more about lichens in a minute, about what they make them up. We're going to call them the pioneer species. So we're going to label that in a minute and talk more about lichens specifically. But lichens are able to grow on rock. And what they do is they start to break down that rock. They help with the erosion, and they help, adding a little bit of soil. When a lichen dies, it gets decomposed, and guess what? Now it becomes those nutrients. So now we have soil and nutrients, two things plants need to survive. And so what happens is bigger plants like grasses can start to move in. Grasses are going to be able to put more nutrients into the soil. It's going to add to the soil. When the grasses die, they actually add more nutrients to the soil. And then eventually it has enough nutrients where shrubs can move in. Shrubs are taller than grass. They're going to shade out the grass. They're going to outcompete them for sunlight. The grasses are going to die, and just like you guessed it, the grasses will decompose, add even more nutrients to the soil, allowing not only just shrubs to grow, but now we have some larger shrubs and some maybe trees. Okay, so I'm going to put shrubs / trees. Now there's two series of trees that can eventually move in. What you're looking at here is a pine tree. What you're looking at here is a deciduous tree, one that bears leaves. So there's two different series of trees that move in. Pine trees are usually smaller than your deciduous trees. And if you think about them, they can photosynthesize year-round so they don't lose their needles, but they get shaded out really quickly when the deciduous trees are in full bloom with their leaves. They can shade out a pine tree easily. And so the deciduous trees are the better competitor. Okay. The big idea of primary succession is that lichens started to make soil. When lichens died, they added nutrients. Then mosses could grow in. Mosses added nutrients to the soil. But when mosses died, it added to the soil, added more nutrients that grasses could move in. Grasses were able to move in because of the amount of soil. When grasses died, they were able to add more nutrients to the soil, then thus making enough nutrients so that shrubs can move in, and so forth and so forth. So as you go down this series, the plant species, I'm going to write this down over here, as plants die, they add nutrients to the soil. This makes the ecosystem better suited for a bigger plant species. Okay? So as you go down in succession, the plant species gets larger, more sophisticated, more complex. Okay? And then at the end, you have this big forest. Now, how long does this take? Hundreds or even thousands of years, depending on how much soil. And when does it end? Okay? I want you to grab your red pen, and I want you to label two things. I want you to circle the word lichen, and we're going to label him the pioneer species. And we're going to talk about what that means in a minute. And then over here, I want you to label the last phase, the climax community. Okay, so now we're going to just discuss a little bit things more in detail since we're done labeling the picture. Okay, primary succession is different than secondary because it takes longer. So first, once you write the word longer, because it is longer when compared to secondary, but it could take hundreds to thousands of years. Okay, and remember, it has to make soil. And that's a really hard thing to do. It takes a very long time to do because we're dealing with either water or wind or ice breaking to erode the rocks. So it's not something that an animal is doing, it's something that the environment is doing. So it takes a very, very long time. Okay, but succession deals with plant species. So primary succession starts with what we call a with rock, and then is made into soil. Okay, so what we need to remember is that this takes a very long time to do. It takes a very long time. Okay? So let's think about this. This bare rock, relate global warming with primary succession. We haven't officially gone over global warming, but global warming is this increase of the Earth's temp, right? So it's the increase of the Earth's temperature. And what it's doing is it's melting glaciers, which are on land. They're either on the tops of mountains, or they're just, in our northern regions. And so when you melt a glacier, what's underneath a glacier? Rock. Okay, so when you melt glaciers, what this does is it uncovers bare rock. Now this rock can start to be eroded and made into soil. Okay, so this starts succession. So primary takes longer. It starts with bare rock, and things like global warming, where we melt the glaciers, can actually expose more rock to be started to be eroded to allow some plant species to move in. Okay, so when we labeled the picture, in red we labeled pioneer species and climax community, right? So pioneer species is one vocab word that is both for primary and secondary succession. So you have to underline that word pioneer. And when you think about what a pioneer is, it's usually the first to do things. Pioneers of our country were the first to move in. So when you look at a pioneer species, it's going to be defined specifically as the first plant species to move in to the ecosystem. Now, who that pioneer species is depends on whether it's primary or secondary succession or the ecosystem that you're in. So since we're talking about primary succession, let's put the word primaries pioneer is called a lichen. A lichen is a really cool animal. They are part algae. Did I say animal? I meant plant. Well, it's part both. It's not an animal. It's part algae and part fungus. So excuse me. It's a part algae and part fungus. Two different kingdoms. Okay. Got a protist, who's a producer, and you got a fungus. Okay, which is in the fungi kingdom. Now grab your red pen. These guys have a symbiotic relationship. And since we just got done talking about symbiotic relationships, I want you to know that they have a mutual relationship, which is plus plus. They both benefit from each other. Okay. They work together as one unit. A lichen is considered one organism made up of two other organisms. The algae is the producer in this relationship, and the fungus is the decomposer in this relationship. And so the algae is going to produce, it's going to photosynthesize, it's going to make that glucose and that the fungus needs to eat, but at the same time, the fungus is helping decompose materials around the lichen to further add the nutrients. The key here is adding nutrients, and that's why this word organics is going to be here. We're talking about nutrients in 1 second. But the lichen is the pioneer species, only for primary. It's made of an algae and fungus, and it's made up of a producer and a decomposer. Okay, number 3, let's relate competition and levels of organics as to why there are different stages of succession. Now, 2 vocab words there is competition, which you know already. 2 organisms want the same thing. And levels of organics is going to be something else that we stress. But organics is going to be a word that we can replace with nutrients. Okay. And I'm going to do 3 elements to you. They're going to be our nutrients. We're going to have carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen. These are the 3 nutrients that we're going to talk a lot about. We're going to bring them back up in eutrophication. Carbon, phosphorus, and nitrogen. So these are the 3 things that are important that plants need to photosynthesize, that we're going to talk about with a bunch of things regarding ecology. Okay, so what I want you to do is I want you to pause the video. I want you to turn to your book and read on page 107 why succession occurs. Okay, and then when you're done, we're going to come back and talk about the organics involved. So pause the video. All right, so now you should have read about the nutrients. And so one thing that you have to understand is that all these plant species, when they die, they get decomposed, which adds nutrients to the soil. Okay, so what we want to add is that when plants get decomposed, they add nutrients to the soil. Okay, here's the thing. What are these plants going to compete for? Okay, they're going to compete for space. They're going to compete for nutrients. They're going to compete for light, right? So when we look at plant competition, they can be for light, space, and nutrients. If you're a really big plant, you need more nutrients. Okay, you're not going to be able to grow in a little bit of soil that doesn't have a lot of space or doesn't have enough nutrients for you. Like that climax community, you're not going to be able to grow if you're on a rock or even just a little bit of soil. And so as we go from phase to phase to phase of succession, going back to our pictures here, when we go back from shrubs to trees, and even grasses to shrubs, when they die, they add nutrients back into the soil. Okay, so what that does is it actually makes it, I want you to write this sentence down, then we're going to draw something a little bit. So it actually makes the soil better suited for another bigger plant. In other words, when a lichen dies and gets decomposed, it's actually making the environment less suitable for itself to grow and more suitable for mosses to grow in. And then when a moss dies and gets decomposed, it's actually making the ecosystem less suitable for mosses and more suitable for bigger plants to grow in. So what I just want you to do really quickly is I want you to draw a box. Oh. Sorry about that box. And we're going to split that box into two phases. And I want you to have a line here, and I want you to have a line here. Okay? I want you to take your red pen, and I want you to scribble a little line here, and then I want you to make more here. And red is going to equal nutrients. Okay? When you go through the different phases of succession, you're adding more nutrients into the soil. So what happens is the plant species change, okay? So maybe this phase you have grasses, right? I'll draw some grasses. But in the next phase, because you have more nutrients, bigger things like shrubs can move in, okay? Bigger plants mean more nutrients. We're actually going to do this in class. So I just want you to write in class and then move on. We're going to watch these videos together to explain any misconceptions. All right, so now we are on to secondary. Secondary succession, here's a picture. If you look at it, it has plants, it has soil. So it begins with soil. Okay, I'm going to change my color to blue. Okay, so it's going to begin with soil. And here's the deal. What would cause, now, we talk about primary succession with glaciers being retreated and exposing bare rock, but, causes for secondary succession can be some type of disaster. Something like you either have a field that's abandoned, so an abandoned field, sorry, my handwriting is sloppy, or some type of natural disaster where an ecosystem has to regrow. Okay, and we'll talk about that more when we get to climax community. But secondary succession over here starts with soil. Okay, and then these are considered your pioneer species. It's not a lichen at this time, right? Now it's plants. Could be flowers, could be grasses. It's definitely not going to be a lichen or moss because those can only grow on rocks, and now we already have soil. The time is only going to be hundreds of years versus hundreds or thousands of years. So it's definitely a lot faster of a process. Let's put it faster up over here. And then over here, just like before, we have our climax community. Okay, so before we get to pond succession, which I want to draw over here, I want to talk about what the climax community is. Okay, the climax community is the most complex community that you can have. So the climax community is the most complex. And I just want you to make a note that the climax community changes depending on the ecosystem. Let me explain what that means. Here we have a picture of a hardwood tree, right? Our deciduous trees at the end. That is something that we could totally see in our backyard, right? But if you go down to Florida, you may not see the same tree species. Or if you go to Colorado and you go up to the top of a mountain, you're not going to ever see a tree species that has leaves or maybe even a tree at all. Maybe you only have shrubs. So the climax community is going to depend on the ecosystem and those abiotic factors, temperature, light, water, all those things that help plants grow. That's going to determine what a climax community is. But if the climax community is destroyed, that's what's going to cause secondary succession. So it can happen after maybe fires. A fire hits a forest and it has to grow back. Maybe a tornado goes through, knocks down trees, and the ecosystem has to grow back. Okay, so it's this idea of the ecosystem growing back. Or it could be something humans, where we have, deforestation. Or we cut down a forest to build something, and then we abandoned it, and it has to eventually become back into a forest. Those are different reasons for secondary succession. Again, it's faster, and it's an ecosystem growing back that was once destroyed. It's not the creation where we have no soil, like primary, where we're starting with bare rock. Okay, lastly, we're going to talk about pond succession in literally 10 seconds because we're doing a lab on this, so you already know what it is. It's a pond drying up becoming land, and then becoming a forest. So our forest in the jar lab is going to be the lab that represents that. And so we're going to go more of upon succession then. Just going to make sure that your notes were complete. And that is succession. 2 types, primary and secondary. Primary definitely is longer. Secondary is definitely faster. Primary starts with rock. Secondary starts with soil. They both have pioneer species. They both have climax communities. It's just they could be different depending on the ecosystem.